Last month we covered the criminal trial of the philosopher Socrates. I gave you an introduction as to who Socrates and his student Plato were, the context of why Socrates found himself at trial, and we then went through the contents of the entire text of Plato's Apology. What conclusions did we draw? That wisdom is difficult to define, that philosophy as practiced by Socrates bears political risks, that Socrates was very annoying basically, and most importantly that this event marked the beginning of a rapid change in the idea of the good citizen. If you haven't watched that video, please do before you continue with this one. Each successive class of BRAINROT University assumes that you are familiar with the contents of the previous lectures. Just to recap, however, there was a philosopher Socrates in the 5th century BC Greece, in Athens, and he had a student named Plato. Socrates never wrote anything down, and it was Plato who chronicled the conversations of Socrates in the form of written dialogues. At some point, Plato went from telling us what Socrates actually said to merely using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. This is something we'll only be talking about in the future, but is always relevant to remember. Socrates was very good at debating people, and after decades of debates and arguments and proving that even the most powerful people in the city know absolutely nothing, he was charged with some crimes, found guilty, and sentenced to death. This is the very basic gist of it, but as I said, this video will rely on you having seen the first lecture.
Class is in session.
Nice.
So excited to do this again. Today we'll be looking at the dialogue Euthyphro. This is the second text out of the 4 that cover the events surrounding the death of Socrates. Although we are looking at it as the second text in the series, chronologically speaking, this is the first text relating to the events around his death. The conversation in the text we're about to look at happened just some weeks prior to the trial of Socrates that we saw last time. In fact, many people start their journey with Plato and Socrates from the text that we're looking at today. But I think that Euthyphro serves better as a prequel to the trial of Socrates. Once you understand the context and events of the slightly more complicated apology,
as we did last month,
the Euthyphro text essentially doesn't need any extra background information whatsoever. All we need to look at is the text itself. How nice and easy, yes? Now, background information. This text was written around the same time, if not earlier, than the apology that we looked at last time. As far as I can tell, it was authored sometime within the 5 years following the death of Socrates in 399 BC. As I mentioned earlier, this is important because the early works of Plato are much more authentic in their presentation of the character of Socrates. We can assume that Plato is not yet trying to push his own ideas through Socrates and is simply retelling the conversation that Socrates claimed to have had. Or is he? More on this later. Much like the other early works of Plato, written directly after the death of Socrates, this text ends without any definitive conclusion to the debate, in a state of confusion. Please comment down below if you remember the ancient Greek word for this literary phenomenon from our first class. I expect very much of all my students indeed. So what is the text about? To put it simply, Socrates meets a certain feller outside the so-called Archon Basileus, the king magistrate building. This is not a place you would typically find Socrates in, or any other citizen for that matter, unless they're up to some legal business. Socrates is there, of course, in relation to being charged. As you will remember from our first lesson, he was charged by 3 individuals on the basis of impiety and corruption of the youth. He's scouting out the area, so to speak. The feller he meets there goes by the name of Euthyphro, and hence the name of the dialogue. Euthyphro is there to prosecute someone. We'll see more about this in the text shortly. They get to talking, and the conversation quickly becomes a debate on piety, holiness, and justice in relation to the gods. You see, Euthyphro is a religious prophet. He's not an official priest of the state, but an unlicensed religious seer, we could say. And so he's been claiming for a very long time now that he knows an insane amount of stuff when it comes to the Greek gods, and he can also tell the future. As we now know from our previous lesson, whenever someone says that they know something, Socrates gets really excited, since he now has an opportunity to prove that this person in fact doesn't know jack. Plus, since Socrates will soon have to defend himself in court against a charge of impiety, it could prove very beneficial for him to speak to an authority on piety, holiness, and the gods in general, so as to prepare a better defense. At this point, there is no other information that you need, and so let us go through the text bit by bit and extract what is necessary. As always, I highly recommend that you read this text before continuing with this video, or immediately afterwards. It is even shorter than the apology, although a bit more complicated in the second half. But I believe in you, and as we said in the past, you'll be able to flex on your stupid dumb moron friends by having read this fantastic work.
So go read it now.
The text begins with Euthyphro noticing Socrates at the Archon Basileus, and he is surprised to see him there. Knowing Socrates personally, he doubts that Socrates is here to settle some private lawsuit that Socrates himself began. He generally doesn't sue people. And Socrates confirms that indeed he is not prosecuting anyone, nor is he settling some kind of private suit, but instead he is the one who is being prosecuted in the so-called public interest. Euthyphro is quite shook at this and naturally asks Socrates as to who the prosecution is. Socrates responds that he doesn't really know the man who is charging him. At this point, Socrates thinks that only one individual is bringing charges against him, not three as we now know. And he knows that the name of this individual is Meletus. You will of course remember Meletus as the only other person to speak in the apology. Socrates throws a little shade at Meletus, saying that his beard is nothing much and that he has a crooked nose. One look at Socrates, however, is enough to conclude that he's just as ugly as Meletus. I'm not the most colorful pencil in the pencil case either, as they say. But anyway, Socrates tells Euthyphro that Meletus is bringing forward the charge of corrupting the youth. With a classic tinge of sarcasm, he says that Meletus appears to be incredibly smart for bringing forward this charge. After all, Meletus is basically saying that he knows what's best for all the youths of Athens, and that he knows this better than Socrates does, the great wise philosopher. To quote Socrates here,
He comes running to the city as if he were running to his mother to accuse me, pussy boy.
and he pays him even more respect, sarcastically of course, for starting his career as a politician in the correct way. You see, when a farmer wants to keep his farm healthy, he first has to make sure that the young plants are cared after, and only then does he begin to care for the older plants that have already grown and are therefore facing less dangers due to their more advanced growth and
Strength.
the same goes for the life of the city. The politician must take care that the youth are not facing any dangers before dealing with the older, experienced, more hardcore pensioners in the population. As it very often does, the sarcasm in this comparison totally goes over Euthyphro's head, and he tells Socrates that his own take on this charge is quite the opposite. Meletus is not trying to take care of a danger for the youth, but instead he is striking at the very heart of the city, which is Socrates. Euthyphro then asks Socrates for more details on the charge, and he answers that he is seen as a maker of the gods, that he makes new gods and doesn't recognize the traditional Athenian ones. In our apology lesson, we saw exactly how Socrates proved that this point is not very coherent, at least not in the way that Meletus presents it. Let us not forget that the persecution of Socrates was deep down a political one, for reasons that I explained in our first class.
As you can see,
There is no way for you to avoid watching it. Euthyphro rationalizes this accusation against Socrates through the mark that Socrates claims to have had for a long time. A demon of sorts that speaks in his head, this divine voice that tells him what not to do. As we said last time, Socrates is mildly schizophrenic. And Euthyphro then says,
Same, bro. I feel. Whenever I speak to people about my religious prophecies, they also laugh at me and don't respect me, even though everything I've ever said eventually came true. They resent people like us that have religious gifts. They laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh.
Socrates tells Euthyphro that being laughed at is no big deal, really, and that it seems that the Athenians don't really mind if someone is gifted or clever. What they do mind is when you go about trying to preach and teach something to others. Keep your schizo shit to yourself, basically. If you don't keep it to yourself, then people either get jealous of the fact that you can teach whatever you want freely, even if it's wrong, or they dislike the fact fact that you convert people to your beliefs. It seems that Athenians didn't really like cults of personality, is what Socrates is saying here. And this is partially true because we can see this with a figure like Epicurus. But anyway, Euthyphro says that he basically has no idea why people dislike him or laugh at him. And Socrates puts forward the theory that maybe it is because Euthyphro does not teach. He has this gift and yet he's not using it to benefit people. He's being some kind of loner weirdo who won't take on any students. Who do you think you are? This is somewhat contradictory to what we just said about the Athenians a minute ago, but I guess you couldn't please the Athenians no matter what you did. A very high standard people. The truth here is that it was a bit sussy to get involved in teaching if your teachings involved some kind of religious or anti-religious undertone. You obviously shouldn't contradict the state's pantheon or religion. And as we all know, Socrates paid the price for this. Socrates then goes on to say that perhaps in his case, people dislike him because he is so free and desperate to impart his teachings wherever he can. If you're reading this text without any other information, then this point is kinda weird. The dude is trying so hard to impart his wisdom on the city for the benefit of the people, and yet a lot of people don't really like this. But as we saw last time, all of this boils down to an issue of politics. Socrates finishes off this small talk part of the conversation by saying that he doesn't really know what's gonna happen at his trial. If they just laugh at him the way they laugh at Euthyphro, then alright. No problem whatsoever. But the trial might also be a much more serious fiasco, in which case Socrates says that only the prophets can know the outcome. To this, Euthyphro the prophet says that whatever happens will happen. How prophetic. Thank you so much. Take all my money now. As you see, we're very early in the text, and yet already Socrates found an indirect way to discredit Euthyphro and his knowledge of the future that he claims to have. This is where the real meat of the dialogue begins, how we pivot into a debate on piety and holiness. Socrates asks what Euthyphro is doing here at the Archon Basileus, and Euthyphro informs him that he's here to prosecute someone. Whomst is he prosecuting? His own father. Alright, maybe they have a land dispute or something, right? Well, it's not that easy because Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates is absolutely losing his mind at this situation and says that Euthyphro must be very wise indeed to be able to prosecute his father for such a grave offense. There are very few people in the world who would choose the divine laws of their state over their own father. And so Socrates makes the assumption that Euthyphro's father must have killed another family member of his. Maybe his mother or a sibling or a nephew or something like that. Because why on earth would you prosecute your father for killing a stranger? Why would you snitch on him? It's your dad, my dude. And Euthyphro, somewhat weirdly, says that actually it does not matter whether the victim here was a stranger or a family member. The only thing that matters in Euthyphro's eyes is whether the killer acted justly, i.e. whether the crime of murder was justified. In this case, this would mean revenge or self-defense. He says another thing here, that if the crime was unfair, then it doesn't matter if the perpetrator himself is a stranger or a family member. Basically, everyone is equal in the eyes of Athenian law. Relationships don't really matter.
Furthermore,
If you are aware of such a man who would do an unfair crime, you are basically just as bad as he is, and you must purify yourself by undergoing the legal process of snitching on him. This is a very idealistic take here in my opinion, and of course you must right now let me know whether you agree with Euthyphro.
Thank you so much for the engagement.
To top all of this off, Euthyphro gives the exact details of what happened, and what happened is this. There is a Greek island by the name of Naxos, which was colonized by Athens under the great statesman Pericles, and so the Euthyphro family built a farm there. His father or even grandfather was probably part of the colonization process. Many Greeks would participate in this in order to set up business in the new colonies. One of the workers on the Euthyphro farm got drunk one night and killed a slave in a fit of anger. This is why I am completely against the consumption of alcohol. And since this slave belonged to the Euthyphro family, the father put the worker in chains and left him all bondaged up in the ditch outside while he left to go fetch the state investigators in order to find out what must be done with the worker as a punishment.
lo and behold,
The chained up worker died of starvation and cold at night. And so Euthyphro sees this as a murder on his father's behalf, that he was irresponsible and left this worker to die. Now before we continue, I'd like to point out that the social class classes here are important. They're not really that important to the text, but I will point out that the worker is not the same as the slave. The worker is still a citizen of Athens, and thus he has certain rights, and in the social hierarchy he is above the slave, even though the worker is still the lowest class of citizen. The slave is not a citizen and therefore has no rights. And so in terms of modern morality, what the worker did is fully unjustified murder of another human being. However, in the Greek world, this is much more an attack on personal property rather than a murder. It is, of course, still a murder, don't get me wrong here, but the sin of murder is a background information here. I think it's very safe to assume that had the worker made it to trial, he'd have to pay a fine to replace the slave, and that's pretty much it. And so Euthyphro says that his family thinks that the father is innocent. The worker was a murderer anyway, so let him die. Who cares? And here Euthyphro begins our descent into the main debate. He says that his family is referring to Euthyphro prosecuting his own dad as unholy. And on top of this, the family doesn't even know what holy and unholy means the way that Euthyphro does because he's a religious prophet. As Socrates usually does, he responds by asking whether Euthyphro himself is certain of what is holy and unholy.
If you accuse your family of not knowing what these things mean, then you surely yourself must know to be able to say such a claim.
Socrates asks Euthyphro whether he is sure that his action of taking his dad to court is in fact a holy thing to do, that the gods are okay with him doing so. And here we see Euthyphro show his true colors, his douchebag colors, as I like to say. And he talks about himself in the third person.
Euthyphro wouldn't be much different from anyone else if he wasn't an authority on all these kinds of things.
What a self-confident prick. Socrates lunges at the opportunity for some sassy attitude. Socrates is brat. And so he says,
Wow, how lucky am I? I have this great authority in front of me who can help me with my impiety charge. Since you know so well about what is holy and unholy, and they are calling me unholy, why don't I become your pupil and you teach me? Please, Master Daddy, show me the way. And if anything goes wrong, I'll just say that I learned all my religious stuff from you. If you're so certain of yourself, then there's no way you'd lose any case in court. So let me just offload all my risk onto you.
Euthyphro's ego is obviously being stroked and caressed here, and he himself agrees that yes, indeed, he would easily find a way out from court, no matter if his opponent is Meletus or anybody else. Euthyphro is just that good. Socrates goes,
Yeah, dude, sure, totally, man, whatever you believe about yourself, for sure, all good, man.
and then guides the conversation in the truly interesting direction for him. He asks Euthyphro what piety and impiety are. He wants a clear definition. Before Euthyphro can answer, Socrates takes it a step further. He asks whether everything that is holy is unchanging in every situation, i.e., is there a set of principles that dictate what the holy is, and thus something that's holy is always holy no matter what situation. And the same goes for the unholy. He asks whether the holy and unholy have a blueprint that he can always follow. He asks if they have forms. For anybody already familiar with Plato, who is watching these videos in order to freshen up on their foundations, you will of course already be familiar with Plato's theory of forms. We are not yet at the text where the forms are expanded on, but this is an extremely important aspect of Plato. For many, it is indeed the central aspect of Plato. I don't want to overcomplicate this video by talking about the theory of forms. This is something that's coming in a couple classes, so I will just briefly say that the forms of Plato are kinda like the ideas of something. When you think about tables, there is an idea of a table which is perfect and from which every real physical table takes inspiration. The idea table doesn't exist as a physical object, obviously, but it is an essence in a separate, perfect, ideal world that is timeless, unchangeable, eternal, perfect, all that good idealistic stuff. And so every real physical table in the world just gets inspired by this idea essence, and it tries to become something like this perfect table in the physical world. This is a very simplistic and basic explanation of it, but it is more than enough for now. But the reason I mention this is because this is one of those times when Plato appears to be using Socrates as a mouthpiece. We know that the theory of forms belongs to Plato, and it seems to have snaked its way way into a dialogue of Socrates, into an early work and more authentic account of Socrates. As Plato gets older and begins using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas more and more, the theory of forms also becomes more prevalent in the debates of Socrates. Here it just appears once as a very basic underlining concept, and to me it always seemed that this is the first instance of Plato realizing,
Hey, I can just put my own thoughts in here if I really wanted to.
sneaky sly little motherfucker that Plato feller.
I digress.
And so what Socrates is getting at is that he wants to hear Euthyphro's definition of piety, and also to see whether Euthyphro agrees with the fact that there exists some perfect idea of what holy things are, that you can use as a measuring stick every single time to judge an act. Socrates basically wants a magical manual, so that whenever he sees an act or even an object, he can consult it and say,
Yeah, this fucking thing, not holy according to clause number 5, but this thing over here, according to clause number 2, very holy indeed, very good, yes.
Euthyphro agrees with the idea of a perfect holiness blueprint, a form, and Socrates then asks him to define the holy and unholy. The genius Euthyphro does a fantastic circle jerk meme and says that what he is currently doing, prosecuting his father, this is holy. Not doing this, therefore, is unholy. What an awesome definition.
Hey man, what is virtuous?
Whatever I do is virtuous.
To support his definition, however, Euthyphro relies on the gods, Zeus specifically. The father of Zeus, the titan Cronus, ate all of his kids up until Zeus, because he had heard a prophecy that one of his kids will overthrow him. Zeus survived with the help of his baby mama, and then chained up his father Cronus as a punishment for eating all the babies. On top of this, back in his youthful days, Cronus himself castrated his own father Uranus as a punishment for being an absent father or something like that. Euthyphro's argument is that everyone loves the gods and their stories and don't have a single problem with the god kids punishing their fathers, and yet when Euthyphro does the same thing, everyone starts whining and soiling their pants.
Hypocrites!
Socrates here sees a chance to do some impiety, as he loves to do time and time again, clearly, and asks Euthyphro whether he truly believes that this drama with Zeus and Cronus and Uranus really happened. Socrates has a really hard time believing in all these stories, and in fact he believes that perhaps this is one of the reasons why he copped that impiety charge. With some classically mild sarcasm, he says to Euthyphro,
If even you, the master of godly knowledge, believes this stuff, then I guess everyone should as well, including me.
Euthyphro responds to him by saying that he hasn't even seen the beginning of it. There's so many goofy ass stories that he couldn't even possibly begin to tell him. And Socrates here once again pivots the conversation here just slightly in order to later get a very important point across. He asks Euthyphro whether he truly believes in the stories that the gods go to war with each other. Euthyphro once again says yes, he knows so many crazy stories which are all true. And Socrates says,
Alright, but let us get back to the point here. I asked you for a definition of holiness, and you just told me that what you're doing is holy. But surely there are so many other things which are holy as well. So instead of giving me examples of holy actions, can you actually describe the form or idea of the holy?
He's basically telling Euthyphro that he still doesn't have the blueprint for judging whether any random act is holy or unholy. Euthyphro here gives us our first real, proper, serious attempt at a definition. What is dear to the gods is holy. What is not dear to the gods is unholy. In even more basic terms, if the gods like something, it is good. If the gods don't like something, it is bad. If you are giga-brained at the skill of argument, then you must have already seen that there are a couple glaring issues with this definition. But let us see how Socrates deals with it. Initially, Socrates is ecstatic with this response.
Finally, we have a definition.
And yet he doesn't know whether this definition is true yet. And so, of course, he expects Euthyphro to argue in favor of his definition. In order for Euthyphro to have an easier time doing this, Socrates summarizes everything once again. He says,
What is loved by the gods, and the man who is loved by the gods, this is the holy. What is hated by the gods, and the man who is hated by the gods, this is the unholy. Holy and unholy are therefore opposites.
Euthyphro agrees with all of this, and then Socrates begins his attack. A minute ago, Socrates asked Euthyphro whether he believes in all the stories of the gods going to war against each other, to which Euthyphro responded, yes, there's so many crazy stories about these kinds of wars between the gods. And Socrates does a very basic deduction. If the gods are going to war with each other, it means that there are hostile feelings between them. Otherwise, why go to war? And so if these hostile feelings exist, then what is the nature of these hostile feelings? What causes them? What is the nature of their disagreement, basically? And in order to find this out, Socrates reduces it to the human level first.
If you and I, Euthyphro, disagree about which number is bigger, what do?
We obviously write our numbers down and see which one is bigger.
Fantastic. I agree. And what if we disagree about which object is heavier? What do?
We obviously weigh the two objects and see which one is heavier.
Yes, very good. And what if we disagree about the size of an object? What do?
Dude, just get to the goddamn point already, my god.
The point that Socrates is making here is that disagreements over physical things do not cause war between people. You can just weigh something or measure it and calculate the truth, and the disagreement is finished. Therefore, what people do really disagree on and fight over are the properties of more subjective things, like beauty, or greatness, or justice. One person might think that Johnny Depp was innocent in his fiasco with the bed-shitter Amber Heard, and yet another person might defend her and say that Depp is an alcoholic raging maniac. The idea of justice in this case is much more complicated and subjective. Your idea of the good, as my viewer, might be something that I consider to be bad. This is the epitome of modern politics, for example. And so because we cannot reach an easy agreement over such things, we tend to disagree and fight. Obviously, the same goes for the gods. This seems to be just a natural quirk of any sentient being that lives in a society. Therefore, we should all live in the woods as hermits and practice great philosophy of the forest. And so, since the same thing can be applied to the gods, it means that the gods go to war with each other because they disagree on what is good and bad, on what is just and what is unjust. Euthyphro is in total agreement so far. And so Socrates says that one group of gods considers something to be just and good and fair, and another group of gods considers the same thing unjust and unfair. Since they don't agree, they go to war, which means that the gods love and hate the same thing at the same time. God number 1 loves what Euthyphro is doing in prosecuting his father, and yet God number 2 hates it and disagrees with it completely. Therefore, Euthyphro's act of prosecuting his father is both loved and hated at the same time. And now, if we remember the definition that Euthyphro agreed on for holiness, that what is loved by the gods is holy and what is hated by the gods is unholy, since we have demonstrated that the gods love and hate the same thing at the same time, this definition fails, because you cannot have opposites, holy and unholy, existing at the same time. They are mutually exclusive.
In fact,
Socrates uses exactly the same argument that I just made. Euthyphro punishing his father might seem like a good thing to the gods Zeus and Hephaestus, but also a terrible thing to Cronus, Uranus, and Hera. And so what Euthyphro is doing is both holy and unholy, and this is not what Socrates asked Euthyphro to define for him. He needs a clear definition which gives a clear, single answer for every single case. Euthyphro's response to this is basically,
yeah, dude, okay, bro, whatever you want. But I'm really sure that the gods agree that killing someone unjustly should carry a punishment.
Socrates continues his attack by turning to the human world once again and asking whether Euthyphro has never seen someone who did a horrible crime argue that he shouldn't pay the penalty. Obviously, Euthyphro says that he's seen this a million times. Just go to the Athenian courts and you will see that this is all that people talk about. All of these people are doing so much messed up crap, and yet they argue at the trials that they don't deserve a punishment. Socrates, however, very intelligently points out that these people never admit to any wrongdoing. Nobody goes to court and says,
hey, yeah, I did this horrible thing, I'm totally guilty, but please don't punish me.
What people do in courts is instead try to prove that they either did not do this thing at all, or even if they did do it, that it was completely justified and therefore they don't need to be punished. It is a question of perception, and Socrates applies the same thing to the gods. Some gods gods think that one thing is justified. Other gods think that this same thing is unjustified. And vice versa, and this goes on back and forth forever. Meaning that there is absolutely no way to prove that every single god agrees that what Euthyphro's father did was unjustified. Some gods might defend Euthyphro's father. After all, the slave did belong to the Euthyphro family, so there are surely some gods who think that his accidental revenge on the worker isn't really wrong in any way, because he did cause damage to the fortune of the Euthyphro family. I will also add this. Furthermore, as they say, the father was trying to get the state to investigate this case, which shows that the father is willing to submit to the laws of the state and of the gods. How the heck would he know that the worker would just die in that ditch? And so Socrates wants Euthyphro to demonstrate that every single god agrees that Euthyphro is right. And Euthyphro says that he actually can, but it's very difficult. Socrates then, in classic brat fashion, says,
Well, since you're planning on proving this to the jury anyway, why not prove it to me right now? Do you think that I'm just really stupid and the jury is much smarter than I am? Come on, big boy, can't you just do it?
And before Euthyphro has a chance to respond, Socrates goes back to the initial point of wanting a clear definition, basically letting Euthyphro off the hook with the really difficult question. Socrates even helps him out a little bit by redefining his own definition in a new way. Now, something that is loved by every single god is holy, and something that is hated by every single god is unholy. All the other stuff that the gods disagree on, whether they like it or hate it, some like it, some don't, this is neutral stuff. It isn't good or bad, it isn't pious or impious, it isn't holy or unholy. It just is. Euthyphro instantly adopts this new definition and even calls it excellent. Wow! And of course, Socrates decides to analyze it immediately. Here comes the most famous question of the entire text. A question which we need to slow down on for a minute, since it is very important to any debates about God, virtue, and so on going forward in the history of philosophy. The so-called Euthyphro Dilemma. The question is as follows. Is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy? Or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? This question may seem confusing to you at first, and if you've read the text, you will see that the way Socrates explains it is low-key garbage. So let me simplify his inquiry for you by way of analogy. Imagine that there is a frog, a beautiful green frog, which we refer to as a holy frog. You and me and all your friends and all our mothers know that this frog is holy, and we also know that the gods love this frog. And so the question then becomes, do the gods love this frog because it is holy, meaning that it already has some kind of inherent holiness, the same way that a square has inherently 4 sides, and therefore the gods just love it because of how holy it is? Or does the fact that this frog is loved by the gods make it holy, meaning that it wasn't holy before, but at some point the gods decided to love it for some reason and then it became holy?
I repeat,
is this frog loved by the gods because it is already holy, or did the frog become holy because the gods chose to love it randomly? This is something we refer to as explanatory priority, and you find plenty of it in philosophy going forward, although I won't confuse you with further examples. All I will say for now is that the framing of this question fails regardless of which answer you pick. Allow me to explain. If you choose option 1, that the frog is loved by the gods because it is already holy, we face the following question. What made this frog holy? We still don't have an answer or any definition as to what exactly the holiness blueprint is. We just know that this frog is holy and therefore the gods love it. Why? If we choose the second option, that the frog becomes holy when the gods decide to love it, we are left with an extremely random blueprint. Why did the gods choose to love this specific frog? Why not any of the other beautiful frogs in the swamp? This basically does not allow us to build any sort of framework for identifying holiness, because we basically have no clue for what reasons the gods picked this specific frog. And so in either case, we see that defining something as holy because it is somehow related to love from the gods doesn't work. Whichever option you pick in this dilemma doesn't really clarify anything for us, because they just increase the state of bamboozlement with further and further questions. The explanation I just gave you is not how Socrates uses this dilemma within the dialogue, and the next few lines that he says are honestly extremely confusing and a headache to read. So if you take anything away from this video at all, it is what I just said for the past few minutes about the holy frog and the Euthyphro Dilemma. And by the way, if you stay until the end, I will have a summary of all the definitions that Euthyphro uses here for your convenience. Do not worry, I know this text is tough for a beginner. Instead of Socrates showing that the two options are impossible, he instead uses these options to contradict the new definition that Socrates and Euthyphro are about to arrive to. Euthyphro, just like most first-time readers of this dialogue, is mega confused as to why Socrates is presenting the dilemma in the first place.
Me no understand.
Socrates guides Euthyphro through his confusing garbage explanation of the dilemma and basically says,
Can we agree that when something is loved, we say it is loved because somebody loves it, and not simply because it has some inherent quality of being loved?
Euthyphro agrees with this clarification, that something can be described as loved because someone loves it. And Socrates then goes through some mental gymnastics to get Euthyphro to agree on the point that the gods love holy things. It is not their love that makes them holy, but they simply love the stuff that is already holy from before. And yet this is impossible.
Why?
Because as we just proved with the example of love, something is loved because someone loves it. And the same goes for holiness. Something is holy because the gods love it. Even though Euthyphro and Socrates just agreed that gods love holy stuff because it is already holy. And yes, my friends, I reiterate, I know this is very confusing and I get big headache when I spend too much time on this segment. I do of course recommend that you spend some time thinking through this segment, but just to summarize, what is already loved by the gods cannot be holy from before, because loving something is what makes it holy. We can use a color to illustrate this a bit better. If you love an object because it is red, then how is it possible for your love to make this object even more red? It's already red from before. A total contradiction. And this in the end leads us to point number 2 in the Euthyphro Dilemma. If loving something makes it holy, how do the gods choose what to love and what to hate? And of course, please do not stress and do not fret. I will summarize all of these definitions at the end. At this point, Euthyphro gives up on all of this and says that this is some kind of verbal circle jerk. And Socrates and him bicker a little bit. A lover's spat.
Your definitions suck.
Actually, your definitions suck.
No, your definitions suck.
At which point Socrates calls Euthyphro lazy in regards to his definitions and offers him another helping hand. He asks him,
Is everything holy also just? And is everything that is just also holy? Or is it that everything that is holy is also just, but not everything that is just is also holy? Only some fair and just things are holy, and some things are something else entirely.
My god.
My god. My god.
I assure you, Plato's work is not usually like this. Euthyphro once again is losing his mind from confusion, and so Socrates assists with a similar example that he draws from the lines of a poet.
Where you find fear, you will also find respect.
Socrates disagrees with this notion. A lot of people fear diseases, poverty, and tyranny, and yet they don't respect those things. Nobody walks around going,
You know, I kinda respect cancer. Scary thing.
What Socrates believes instead is that where you find respect, you will also find
Fear.
When you respect the king, you not only fear his power, but you may also fear seeming lowly or weak in the eyes of this king. And yet when you fear a king, you might not respect him at all because he is just a tyrant and you want to see him beheaded. And so Socrates goes on to say that there is more fear in the world than respect, and therefore respect is just a subset of fear. Not everything that is feared is respected, but everything that is respected is feared. We can illustrate this with numbers, as Socrates does. Not all numbers are odds, but all odds are numbers. Therefore, odds are a subset of numbers.
If you were good at maths in school, then this section should be very easy for you to understand.
Therefore, Euthyphro and Socrates agree that the holy is a subset of the just. There are more just and fair things in the world than holy things. And so not every single just thing is holy, but every holy thing is just. But the problem now arises in having to determine which part of the just the holy makes up. If there is so much just and only part of it is holy, which part exactly? And so the great Euthyphro blesses us with another definition, a very specific one. The part of the just which has to do with looking after the gods is pious and holy. All other versions of just and fair things which look after humans form the non-holy part. What means looking after? Socrates has the same question. Surely there is no way that Euthyphro just implied that we look after gods the same way we look after animals and children. This is blasphemy, very rude and disrespectful to these phenomenal, powerful beings. We are lowly, trash humans. How could we possibly look after the gods? Euthyphro doesn't really get a chance to object to this because Socrates says the following immediately. When you look after a horse, you are doing it for the benefit of the horse. So when humans look after gods, which is something that Euthyphro appears to be saying, we are doing it for the benefit of the gods. And if this act is holy, then what Euthyphro is saying is that humans do holy things by making the gods better. Euthyphro instantly sharts in his pants at this insinuation and instantly backpedals to say that in absolutely no way can we petty, disgusting human beings trash improve the amazing, all-powerful gods. And so Euthyphro corrects himself by explaining that when he says looking after, he means the same relationship that a slave has towards his master. The slave looks after the master, but not in a parental way. The slave does this in a serving way, by being submissive and breathable. Socrates understands this argument very well and proceeds to attack again. He clarifies that us looking after the gods is a service just like any other service you find on the market, which Euthyphro doesn't object to here. And so Socrates thinks of some common professions. The doctor serves his patients, but he has a higher goal in mind, which is the goal of health. The same goes for the shipbuilder. He is serving his clients, but his grander goal is to build perfect ships. And this applies to every other profession. And this is all very fine and dandy, but then we are stumped by the following question. What is the higher goal of our service to the gods? If all other professions and services have a thing they strive for, what is it that we are then striving for in having our gods as our client base? Socrates keeps asking this question to Euthyphro on and on again, and nagging him on with some amusing comments about how great of an authority Euthyphro is on these matters, and Euthyphro basically keeps saying,
dude, I can answer this question, trust me. I have a very good answer, just trust me.
What is the goddamn answer?
It's a very good answer. We strive for many good things. This is what we strive for. Good things, lots of them.
Goddamn moron, this Euthyphro, right? Socrates catches him here instantly and points out that we can say the same thing about army generals. They also do and strive for many good things, but we can say what these things are if we really focus. They strive toward winning wars. They strive toward keeping their units intact. The same can be said about the farmers. They strive toward growing good crops. So what about us and our service to the gods? What are we striving for? What's the ultimate goal here? Euthyphro refuses to answer this question and repeats for the millionth goddamn time that he could explain this if he wanted to, but he basically won't. To be fair, he does try to give a very simple statement here. He knows for a fact that if you do and say things that please the gods when you worship them, your home and country will be safe. And therefore holiness is when you do worshipping rituals and all that sort of stuff that the gods like. The perceptive student here will notice that we are appearing to circle back to something that we've discussed before. Socrates really begins mocking Euthyphro here.
Dude, you were so close. You almost enlightened me, and yet you didn't. So I have to keep debating you here, man, because I'm just so stupid and I need an answer from you. I don't know anything.
And for one last time, Socrates offers a helping hand to Euthyphro with another definition. Holiness is the knowledge of how to correctly sacrifice and pray to the gods. Euthyphro the sheep again agrees with this, and so Socrates then asks what the purpose of prayer is. Isn't it just a request for something from the gods? Going by this logic, holiness is just knowing how to ask the gods for stuff. Give me that. Euthyphro is ecstatic here. He's creaming his pants. Socrates has finally understood what he was trying to say all along, and yet Socrates smells an offensive opportunity. If praying and sacrificing to the gods is basically the knowledge of how to give them stuff and get stuff back in return, isn't this then just the art of bartering, the art of trade? Euthyphro agrees. However, while we know exactly what we get out of this relationship, which is basically all the good things that we have because they're all thanks to the gods, what exactly do the gods get out of this relationship? They are mighty and awesome and epic and sigma. They have whatever they want. What do they need our sacrificed goats and trinkets for? Euthyphro quickly clarifies here that what they get out of this relationship is love, honor, and respect, which still doesn't really change the point that why would the gods need this, but according to Euthyphro, the gods get pleasure out of being respected, honored, and loved by us. But here we face our very final issue. If our worship of the gods is holy, and if our worship gives them pleasure, it means that the holy gives pleasure to the gods, which therefore means that the holy is what is loved by the gods, because they love pleasure. And we are now back at our very first definition, which obviously failed. This entire conversation has been one gigantic loop that had no results whatsoever, except proving that the definitions proposed by Euthyphro lead to an entire circle jerk. And now Socrates here, being the word cell autist that he is, insists that they must restart the entire conversation with a new definition, that all of this is way too important for them to simply abandon in a state of confusion. And, of course, you guessed it, Euthyphro tells him,
"No thank you, gotta go now."
and legs it. Socrates taunts him one last time as he's walking off.
How can you leave? This is so important to me. You are so smart. If you taught me properly, I could change my life forever. I could prove to Meletus that I am a new man. Oh no, what an idiot.
And so the dialogue ends. Congratulations on making it to this point. I know that this one is a bit of a headache, but I hope that my upcoming conclusion section will help you out a little bit. As you see, Socrates completely pwned Euthyphro here, specifically when it comes to defining piety. The problem here is not that piety itself cannot be defined, because it can if you try hard enough, but that the definitions provided by Euthyphro, Mr. Prophetic Douchebag over here, fail completely. Mayhaps there is no sense in including the gods in a definition of piety. This is of course a weird suggestion, but evidently any definition that includes the gods in it fails, as Socrates displays here. The gods are essentially too arbitrary for us to use as a basis for defining piety. And so what should the basis be then? This sort of question leads us to a very interesting point. While on the surface this dialogue is about piety and holiness, the true theme of this work is about definitions. People have definitions for everything, and yet how many of these definitions hold up to scrutiny? Do our languages sufficiently define concepts? Personally, I find this dialogue easier to understand in my native tongue. I find that English can be a bit confusing with all this back and forth. Something is loved because it is holy, or it is holy because it is loved. Socrates here is not only criticizing some typical definitions of holiness, but is also exposing the fact that definitions themselves are often very wonky. And when you start to analyze them, they either fall apart or change into something else entirely, which can often just contradict itself by the end of the debate. Precisely what happened to Euthyphro. And so many topics can be substituted into the format of this dialogue. Goodness, strength, beauty, whatever. The point remains that definitions are very often feeble and difficult. Before I let you go, I would like to quickly summarize the 6 definitions that Euthyphro gave for piety and holiness, and how exactly Socrates argued against him. This will be very quick and brief, I promise. If you struggled understanding parts of this video, then this will be perfect for you.
You are welcome, of course.
I joke, obviously. Making these videos for you is the highest pleasure of my miserable life. Definition number 1. Holiness is exactly what I'm doing, prosecuting my father for murder. Counterpoint. This is only an example of holiness and not a definition. Definition number 2. What is dear to the gods is holy. What is not dear to the gods is unholy. Counterpoint. The gods disagree with each other on what they like and dislike. Therefore, things are both holy and unholy at the same time. Definition number 3. What all the gods like is holy. What all the gods dislike is unholy. Counterpoint. The Euthyphro Dilemma. Is something holy because it is loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it is holy? Both options ultimately fail as a definition. Definition number 4. Holiness is a subset of justice, which looks after the gods. Counterpoint. What does looks after mean? We don't look after gods the same way we look after horses. Definition number 5. Holiness is a subset of justice which serves the gods in worship and so on. Counterpoint. What do the gods get out of this relationship from us measly humans? Definition number 6. Holiness is the art of trading with the gods. Counterpoint. What do the gods get out of this? Pleasure? Then they love this holiness. Hence we return to definition number 2. And so our lesson comes to an end. Thank you for attending.
Whoa! Yeah!
Please let me know your thoughts and prayers in the comments below. And please read the text for yourself. Now I have a little update for the channel for my existing subscribers. I enjoy making these videos a lot more than all my other videos, and so I would like to focus much more on BRAINROT Uni, especially considering that there is a lot of material to go through and posting once a month is just not enough. You and I will both forget everything by the time we get to our next class. And so the next lecture of BRAINROT Uni will be much sooner than you think. Come philosophize with me in my great Discord if you haven't already. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Ciao.